Here's something that you don't see every day, maybe not ever. A great white shark filmed in the Mediterranean Sea.
Captured by a diving team in the Strait of Sicily during a mission to remove so-called ghost nets trapping marine life in an offshore shipwreck. Great white sharks are native to the Mediterranean, but their survival has been critically endangered due to human activities such as overfishing.
There's a moment, somewhere around 200 feet below the surface of the sea, where the ocean stops feeling like water and starts feeling like a different planet. The light is gone, or nearly gone. The temperature drops until it settles into a permanent chill that no wetsuit fully solves. Sound behaves strangely, sight behaves strangely, and time itself starts to behave strangely because every second down there is being measured, counted, and paid for in dissolved gas and diminishing air. It is not a place where human beings belong, and everyone who goes there knows it. That is exactly the kind of place two divers were working in off the coast of Sicily when something swam out of the haze that, by every reasonable expectation of modern marine science, should not have been there at all. This is the story of that encounter, of a routine, unglamorous cleanup dive that turned, in the space of about 90 seconds, into one of the most significant pieces of underwater footage ever recorded in European waters. It is also the story of an animal that has been quietly living in the Mediterranean Sea for longer than human beings have existed as a species. An animal so rarely seen that entire careers in marine biology have been built without a single scientist ever laying eyes on one alive. And it is the story of what that footage means, both as a moment of wonder and as a warning. The dive did not begin as a shark story. It began as garbage collection of a particularly dangerous and technical kind. Roughly 50 miles off the coast of Sicily, in the stretch of water known as the Strait of Sicily, the narrow, current-swept channel that separates the southern tip of Italy from the coast of Tunisia, a small team of technical divers descended toward the wreck of a sunken ship. Their target was not treasure or history. It was netting, tangled, abandoned fishing gear that had settled onto the wreck over years, possibly decades, and was still doing exactly what it had been built to do long after any fisherman had walked away from it. This kind of work has a name in diving circles. It is called ghost net removal, and it is carried out by volunteer teams of technical divers around the world who specialize in going to depths and into environments that recreational divers are trained to avoid. One of the divers on this particular mission was affiliated with an international volunteer network dedicated to exactly this task, locating derelict fishing gear on wrecks and reefs, and physically cutting it free, section by section, so that it can be hauled to the surface and disposed of instead of continuing to trap and kill marine life indefinitely. The reason this work matters is grim, but simple. A fishing net that slips off a boat, breaks free from its mooring, or is deliberately cut loose because it has become too damaged to repair does not stop functioning just because no one is holding the other end of it anymore. It continues to fish. Fish and rays swim into the mesh and cannot back out. Their struggling and dying attracts scavengers, which get tangled in turn, and the net keeps working long after the humans who deployed it have forgotten it exists. Sea turtles surface for air and find only mesh above them. Estimates from conservation groups suggest that somewhere between 3 and 10% of all fishing gear used globally each year ends up lost at sea in exactly this way, left behind to keep killing without purpose, without profit, and without end, sometimes for decades, sometimes indefinitely, unless someone physically goes down and cuts it away. That is what the team was doing on this particular morning, descending a line into cold, darkening water toward a shipwreck they already knew was choked with old netting, planning to cut it free in sections, bag it, and bring it back to the surface. It is slow, physically demanding, unglamorous labor performed far from any camera crew or research grant. The kind of environmental work that rarely makes headlines because there is, on most days, no dramatic moment to report. Just nets, cut a little at a time, by people who will never be thanked by name for doing it. To understand why what happened next carried the weight it did, it helps to understand what 200 feet of seawater actually does to a human body and a human dive plan. This is not shallow reef diving with an easy, unhurried return to the surface whenever a diver feels like it. At that depth, every element of the dive is governed by hard physical limits that cannot be negotiated, rushed, or ignored no matter what happens. The first limit is gas. Pressure at depth compresses everything. The air in a diver's lungs, the neoprene of a wetsuit, the small pockets of air trapped in a dive mask. A single breath drawn from a regulator at 200 feet consumes several times more gas from the tank than the same breath would consume at the surface, because the diver is breathing air compressed to match the surrounding water pressure. That means the supply of breathable gas a diver carries down is not really a countdown clock in the ordinary sense. It is a fuel gauge, and it burns down faster the deeper a diver goes and the harder that diver works, cutting, hauling, fighting current, or, as it turned out, reacting to the unexpected. The second limit is less visible but no less absolute. Decompression obligation. Every minute spent at depth allows dissolved gas to build up in a diver's tissues. Gas that has to be released slowly and in a specific sequence on the way back to the surface. Skip that sequence, rush it, or interrupt it, and a diver risks decompression sickness, what used to be called the bends, a condition that can range from painful to fatal. This obligation accumulates silently in the background regardless of what else is happening in the water. It does not pause for excitement. It does not care what a diver just saw. A technical diver working at 200 feet has effectively purchased a fixed window of working time, and that window closes on schedule, whether the job is finished, whether the mission goes perfectly, or whether something extraordinary swims into view. Every technical diver going down that line that day understood this arithmetic instinctively, the way a pilot understands fuel range or a mountaineer understands weather windows. It is not something you think about consciously once you are experienced. It is something your body and your training calculate for you, continuously, in the background. Which is exactly what makes what happened next so remarkable. None of that background math stopped running, even while something almost nobody expected to see was gliding directly toward them. A few minutes into the dive, working near the collapsed structure of the wreck, one of the divers noticed the water beyond the ship change. It is difficult to describe precisely what that looks like from inside a dive mask at that depth. The visibility at 200 feet is limited. The color spectrum has already been stripped down to blues and grays and greens by the water itself, and shapes tend to resolve slowly out of a kind of underwater fog rather than appearing all at once. What emerged from that haze was not moving quickly. It was not aggressive. It simply arrived, the way weather arrives, or the way a large shadow falls across a room before you look up to find its source. It was a great white shark. Later analysis of the footage placed its length at somewhere around 13 feet. An adult animal, fully grown, moving with the loose, economical, unhurried motion of a creature that has never once had to consider what might be hunting it. It turned toward the divers, and for the better part of 90 seconds, an adult great white shark swam close enough, by some estimates within 9 or 10 feet, for its eye to be seen rotating in its socket as it tracked the two divers' movement, close enough to watch its gill slits open and close in rhythm with its own forward motion, close enough to see the precise, ragged line where the gray of its upper body gives way to the pale white of its underside. By the account of the diver holding the camera, his hands were shaking so badly in that moment that he nearly lost his grip on the equipment entirely. His breathing accelerated, which at that depth is not a small detail. It is a direct and immediate draw against an already limited air supply. His heart rate spiked, and yet he kept the camera rolling, because some instinct beneath the fear recognized correctly that what was happening in front of him might never happen again in his lifetime, and that it needed to be recorded. What the footage shows, though, is not what decades of shark movies and news coverage might lead anyone to expect. The animal shows no signs of aggression whatsoever. There is no sudden acceleration, no tightening circle, no test bump of the kind researchers associate with predatory investigation, no arching of the back or dropping of the pectoral fins into a threat posture. The shark does not appear to register the two divers as a problem requiring any kind of decision at all. It simply glides past them, seemingly indifferent to the presence of two small, bubble-exhaling creatures hovering near its territory. And after its unhurried pass, it turns away entirely on its own terms and dissolves back into the blue water beyond the wreck, gone as calmly as it arrived. It is worth sitting with that description for a moment, because it runs directly against the cultural weight the word shark carries. What the camera captured was not a monster. It was a wild animal, an old, established resident of a particular stretch of ocean, going about what was, for it, presumably an entirely ordinary day. When the shark finally vanished back into deeper water, The two divers were left alone at the wreck with a half-filled bag of cut netting, a gas supply that had been burning the entire time, and a decompression schedule that had not paused for even a second while any of it was happening. The ascent from that depth is not a quick swim back to the boat. It is a slow, deliberate series of mandatory stops at specific depths, each one held for a set number of minutes, during which a diver has essentially nothing to do but hang in open water, watch a timer, and wait. For the diver who had just filmed the encounter, that meant spending a long stretch of time suspended in the very same water column the shark had disappeared into, with no way to speed up the process and no way to communicate with anyone on the surface about what had just happened. There was nothing to do but sit inside the fact of it, the adrenaline slowly draining out of his system while the animal itself remained, as far as he knew, somewhere nearby and entirely unaccounted for. It is an oddly fitting final chapter to the encounter. After 90 seconds of pure astonishment, hours, or at least a very long stretch of minutes, of forced stillness, alone with the memory of it. When the divers finally surfaced, and the footage made its way off the camera and into the hands of people who understood exactly what they were looking at, it became clear almost immediately that this was not simply an unusually good story to tell at a dive bar. It appears to be the first underwater video ever recorded of a living, adult great white shark in the Mediterranean Sea. To understand why a single sentence like that can send a ripple through an entire field of marine science, it helps to understand just how strange the relationship between this particular sea and this particular animal has always been. The Mediterranean is not, and has never been, considered a place where great white sharks occasionally wander in by accident. It is recognized habitat, has been for as long as records have existed, in the same way that certain coastlines are recognized habitat for wolves or grizzly bears even in years when nobody spots one. This is a critical distinction. The Mediterranean sighting was not comparable to a confused humpback whale turning up somewhere far outside its normal range and making international headlines for the novelty of it. Great white sharks are supposed to be in the Mediterranean. The problem, and it is a severe one, is that almost nobody ever actually sees one, and live underwater sightings, of the kind where a diver is close enough to make eye contact with the animal, are so rare that scientists who study the population have compared the odds, without exaggeration, to winning a lottery. That rarity has shaped the entire scientific record in an unusual and limiting way. The overwhelming majority of what is currently known about Mediterranean great white sharks did not come from observing live, healthy animals moving through their own environment. It came from examining dead ones, sharks accidentally caught and killed in commercial fishing nets, then hauled up, measured, and studied after the fact. Imagine trying to build a complete understanding of how wolves live, hunt, raise young, and move through a landscape by only ever being allowed to examine wolves that had already died. That is roughly the position Mediterranean shark researchers have been in for generations. And this is not a population that recently arrived. Genetic research, most notably a landmark study led by researchers at the University of Bologna, which examined DNA drawn from historical shark remains and museum specimens collected across the past 2 centuries, has produced findings that are difficult for a human mind to fully absorb. That research concluded the Mediterranean great white population has likely been genetically isolated from every other great white shark population on the planet for approximately 3.2 million years, a span of time reaching back into the Pliocene epoch. For context, that predates the earliest stone tools ever made by early human ancestors. It predates the emergence of our own genus, Homo, entirely. While continents drifted, ice ages advanced and retreated, and the modern human species eventually emerged, evolved, and spread across the planet, this specific lineage of sharks has been quietly circling the same enclosed sea, generation after generation, almost completely cut off from the rest of its own species. Stranger still is where the genetic evidence suggests this population actually came from. Rather than being closely related to great white sharks living in the nearby open Atlantic, just on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar, Mediterranean sharks appear to be more closely related genetically to great white shark populations on the far side of the planet in the Pacific Ocean. The leading explanation involves geography that no longer exists. An ancient marine passage that once connected the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, before the Isthmus of Panama rose out of the sea roughly 3 million years ago and permanently joined North and South America. When that connection closed, the climate of the Atlantic shifted dramatically, and many species that had lived there, quite possibly including white sharks, died out locally. The Atlantic is believed to have later been repopulated by an entirely separate wave of white sharks, likely originating from the waters off southern Africa. Sharks that carry a different genetic signature than the ancient lineage still moving quietly through the Mediterranean today. In other words, the sharks patrolling the waters off Sicily are not distant cousins of the sharks in the nearby Atlantic. They are an entirely separate, ancient branch of the species, sealed inside an enclosed sea by an accident of continental drift, and left largely alone there for roughly 3 million years. That same genetic research uncovered something else, and it was not encouraging. Genetic diversity within the modern Mediterranean great white population is troublingly low. A small, isolated population that has been reproducing largely among itself for millions of years inevitably carries far less genetic variation than a large, well-connected one spread across open ocean. Low genetic diversity is dangerous in a very specific, almost mechanical way. Harmful mutations have an easier path to accumulating and persisting, and the population as a whole has less built-in resilience to absorb disease outbreaks, environmental disruption, or any new pressure that arrives faster than evolution can respond to it. Researchers involved in that genetic work have been direct about what this means. This is very likely a small, endangered community of animals, one that may be considerably more vulnerable to disappearing entirely than a simple head count would suggest, precisely because its capacity to withstand a serious shock is already compromised at the genetic level, before any single fishing net or polluted stretch of coastline even enters the picture. For centuries, of course, nobody living along the Mediterranean's coastlines had any of this genetic context. They documented the animal anyway, often without fully grasping what they were recording. Historical accounts stretch back to the Middle Ages, describing large, frightening sharks pulled from these waters or observed attacking prey close to shore. Fishermen's logs, old port records, and paintings or engravings in which an unmistakable set of teeth appears somewhere in the corner of a scene, ostensibly about something else entirely. One independent researcher has spent decades quietly compiling a private archive of historical Mediterranean great white sightings, working through old fishing records, museum specimens, artwork, and first-hand accounts from fishermen and divers stretching back hundreds of years. That archive has grown to more than 700 documented entries. One particularly striking account comes from Spain in the summer of 1862, describing an attack on a swimmer near a beach close to Malaga. A warm, ordinary summer day along the coast, interrupted by an incident sudden and severe enough to be written down and preserved for more than a century and a half afterward. Locals at the time attributed the attack to what they called, in the language of the era, a sea monster. Based on later analysis of the surviving account, researchers now believe it was almost certainly a great white shark. It is a sharp reminder that this animal's presence in these waters is not new, fashionable, or the product of some recent ecological shift. It is ancient. It predates every coastal city currently standing on those shores by an almost incomprehensible margin. What is new and genuinely alarming is how rarely anyone encounters the species anymore. The historical record shows an animal that was, at various points in the past several centuries, close to a routine feature of life along Mediterranean coastlines. Not common in the sense of being seen every week, but present, documented, known to fishermen, occasionally responsible for an attack, occasionally painted, occasionally argued about over drinks in a harbor town. The modern record shows something very different: a slow, steady disappearance. Researchers studying the regional population estimate that it has declined dramatically over the past several decades. Current assessments suggest a drop of at least 80% across roughly 3 generations of the species, a span that, because great white sharks are long-lived and slow to reproduce, stretches across nearly 7 decades of real time. An 80% decline within living memory is not a distant historical tragedy. It is something that has happened, largely unnoticed by the wider public, within the lifetime of people alive today. The causes are not mysterious or contested among researchers. Overfishing, accidental bycatch in commercial fishing nets, degradation of coastal and offshore habitat across virtually the entire Mediterranean basin, An outright persecution driven by a fearsome reputation the animal never earned and does not deserve have combined to push the population toward the edge. The broader global classification for great white sharks, issued by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, lists the species worldwide as vulnerable to extinction. The Mediterranean's genetically distinct subpopulation, however, is assessed far more severely. Critically endangered, one category above extinct in the wild, and one category below merely vulnerable. The species' own biology makes recovery brutally difficult. Great white sharks take many years to reach sexual maturity, and even mature females produce a relatively small number of offspring across a long lifespan. That reproductive strategy works well for an apex predator in a stable, undisturbed ocean, where there is little urgency to replace lost numbers quickly. It becomes a serious liability the moment external pressure, fishing, habitat loss, bycatch, starts removing animals faster than the population can naturally replace them. A population this small and this slow to reproduce simply does not have the capacity to bounce back quickly from sustained losses, no matter how resilient individual sharks might otherwise be. Confirmed sightings in recent decades have been sparse enough that each one tends to become its own small news event. In 2018, off the Balearic island of Cabrera, near Mallorca, a Spanish marine conservation group reported spotting a great white shark roughly 16 feet long at the surface in daylight, in one of the most heavily used recreational sailing regions on Earth. It was the first confirmed sighting in Spanish waters in almost 3 decades. More recently, a young great white shark, small enough that researchers estimated its length at under 7 feet and its weight at under 200 pounds, clearly a juvenile, was accidentally caught in Spanish Mediterranean waters. The presence of a juvenile matters enormously to researchers, because a juvenile implies successful reproduction somewhere nearby, which in turn implies breeding adults, which in turn implies that something is still quietly continuing out there, mostly out of sight. That single incident triggered a fresh wave of historical research, with scientists digging back through old records all the way to 1862 and eventually cataloging more than 60 separate documented occurrences in Spanish waters alone, many of them clustered curiously around the Balearic Islands. That same research pointed toward a possible connection between shark movement patterns and the migration of Atlantic bluefin tuna, suggesting these sharks may be tracking a major prey species through Mediterranean waters at particular times of year. What almost all of these documented encounters share, though, is that they're separated by years, sometimes by entire decades, and nearly all of them occur at the surface. Almost never does anyone witness one of these animals underwater, alive, moving freely through its own habitat, entirely on its own terms. Which is exactly why the footage from the wreck near Sicily became something far larger than a good story for the boat ride home. When the footage from the Strait of Sicily reached researchers who specialize in the region's shark populations, the reaction was not simply excitement. It was something closer to relief mixed with a sharp new sense of urgency. As noted earlier, most existing knowledge about Mediterranean great whites has come from dead specimens. Animals accidentally caught and killed in fishing operations, then examined and cataloged afterward. Live observations, and especially detailed, high-quality underwater footage of the kind captured on this dive, are treated as extraordinarily valuable because they offer something a dead specimen simply cannot: a direct window into how these animals actually move, behave, and use their habitat in real time. A measurement can be taken from a body pulled out of a net. Behavior cannot. The location itself carried real scientific weight as well. The Strait of Sicily, that narrow, biologically rich channel separating Italy and Tunisia, is considered by some researchers to be one of the last true strongholds for the Mediterranean's dwindling great white population, a natural crossroads shaped by ocean currents and migratory routes, and evidently still a corridor where an animal many assumed was nearly gone is quietly passing through, largely unnoticed by the world above. It is worth remembering, too, why the volunteers were 200 feet underwater in the first place, because it had nothing whatsoever to do with sharks. It was cleanup work, the unglamorous, physically punishing job of removing lost fishing nets from wrecks that, left unattended, become unintentional death traps disguised as thriving artificial reefs. A small team of volunteer divers, working within a severely limited window of bottom time, happened to be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right depth, at exactly the right moment to witness something a great many people in marine science had quietly stopped expecting to see at all. The organizers behind the dive were quick to frame the encounter within that larger context. It was never really about producing a viral clip of an impressive predator. It stood as rare, tangible proof that despite decades of decline, despite pollution and overfishing and the well-documented erosion of so much Mediterranean marine life, there remains enough biodiversity in these offshore waters to draw in and sustain one of the ocean's most demanding apex predators. An apex predator is, in a sense, a kind of receipt. Nothing produces one unless the entire ecological structure underneath it is still standing. A 13-foot great white cruising past a wreck 50 miles off Sicily is evidence that the food web beneath it has not yet fully collapsed. Researchers, however, were careful to attach an important note of caution to all the excitement. A single rare sighting, however remarkable, does not automatically mean the population is recovering. Scientists studying the phenomenon have pointed out that climate change often redistributes marine species rather than genuinely increasing their numbers. As waters warm and prey species shift their own ranges in response, sharks may simply begin appearing in places, or at times of year, where they were historically less common, without the underlying population actually growing at all. More sightings could mean more sharks. It could also mean that the same small, struggling population is simply becoming easier to stumble across as everything around it rearranges itself in response to a changing ocean. That distinction cannot be settled by a single clip, no matter how extraordinary it is. Part of what makes that uncertainty so consequential is built directly into the biology of the species. Great white sharks are, by nature, wide-ranging, restless animals. In other parts of the world, individual sharks are known to migrate staggering distances across entire ocean basins in pursuit of seasonal prey, moving with little regard for the boundaries humans draw on maps. For years, that basic biological tendency made the idea of a population living quietly and semi-permanently inside the smaller, semi-enclosed waters of the Mediterranean seem almost implausible to some researchers. The Mediterranean connects to the wider Atlantic only through the narrow bottleneck of the Strait of Gibraltar, a relatively small doorway for an animal fully capable of crossing entire oceans if it chose to. But the genetic evidence has settled that particular question. This is indeed a distinct, largely self-contained population, one that has adapted over millions of years to a smaller, more enclosed range than its wide-ranging relatives elsewhere on the planet. That long-term isolation, which makes the population so scientifically fascinating, is also part of exactly what makes it so vulnerable today. A shark population confined largely to one relatively small, heavily fished, heavily trafficked sea does not have the option of simply swimming away from human pressure into some untouched corner of the ocean the way a more far-ranging population might. Every abandoned fishing net, every degraded stretch of coastline, every disruption to the Mediterranean's food web lands directly and disproportionately on this one ancient, irreplaceable group of animals. They cannot leave. That, in the end, is the whole problem. There is also a quieter, more technical complication tucked inside the broader research, and it matters for how the historical sighting record ought to be interpreted. Scientists note that juvenile great white sharks in the region can sometimes be mistaken for another critically endangered species found in the same waters, the short-fin mako shark, and the confusion runs in both directions, with makos occasionally logged as white sharks and young white sharks occasionally logged as makos. This is part of why confirmed, high-quality footage becomes even more scientifically valuable than a written sighting report. It eliminates any ambiguity about exactly which species researchers are looking at. There is no such ambiguity in the footage from the Strait of Sicily. It is not an interpretation, a guess, or a probable identification based on a distant silhouette. It is an adult great white shark, filmed alive, at depth, in a sea where that had reportedly never been captured on video before.